Hello, Andrew here. Welcome to Lecture 8 in the Using Creative Multimedia for Youth Engagement module. This lecture will be on the Internet and social activism. Now, in the previous module on games, we covered quite a lot of this, so it's going to be a little bit shorter and just a bit more kind of media content to discuss it here, because I'll be referencing elements, especially in relation to gaming, that we would have discussed elsewhere as well. But with that in mind, we'll crack on. Now, just from Andy Ruddock's book, Youth and Media, just this comment, just to kind of show how intrinsic the nature of democracy and politics are in relation to young people and media in particular these days. The matter of how young people understand media and how they understand themselves as citizens with rights and responsibilities are closely connected. The presence of this debate shows that the question of how media influence young people is often about the nature of democracy. Okay, we could argue that that's never been more so the case, where previously where media would have just been left to the realms of expression and entertainment. Now it's kind of infused with, your civic and human rights and, data protection policies, every sort of issue around this and how you relate to the world in essence is all kind of tied in there. So it's never been more of a kind of this generation, and have never had it so sort of vital a part of their lives in terms of media. So with that in mind, we're going to kind of just kind of discuss a few ends of that, and mostly how this can all be, as youth workers, be made apparent to young people, or to have them supported as they be kind of giving them the information and knowledge around this. So I'm just going to play the first video talking about just kind of giving us a state of play in relation to this sort of social disinvestment in youth, and kind of gives us a rundown. It'll be from this kind of an American neoliberal sort of aspect of it, but we can take that as a strong enough frame for how this is being rolled out globally, I suppose.
Well, I think that at the essence of neoliberalism is the notion that the essence of democracy is basically about making money. That the market is a template for all social relations. That anything that doesn't fit into market values, it really basically doesn't count. That there's a massive transfer of public wealth to private hands. There's an ongoing attempt to privatize almost everything. There's an attempt to deregulate business. There's an attempt to basically hold back all those institutions and organizations that speak to the public good, whether we're talking about education, or we're talking about unions, or we're talking about social provisions. So, I think overall what you're seeing in neoliberalism is an attempt to basically completely undo the parameters of the public, to do away with all notions of the public, whether it's an ideology, whether it's a mode of transportation, or whether it's basically a mode of solidarity, and to utterly privatize those things so as to assume and to claim that the only thing that really motivates people is really making money, that profit is the essence of all human relationships. We've lost the language of compassion, and we've lost the public spheres that nourish it, and we've lost a media that has any interest in it. In a world in which sovereignty is now corporate rather than political, and corporations define values, and corporations define social relationships, and corporations define what matters in life. What matters is money. So you get sick. I'm going to reward the person who works for me in my insurance company for making sure you don't get the treatment you need, because that's going to save me money. Somehow economics now drives politics, and economics has completely divorced itself from any sense of ethical considerations and social cost. Young people are basically in a position unlike they ever have been before. Given what is the social disinvestment in young people that's gone on since the 1980s, is really quite remarkable. In my vocabulary, I call it a war on youth. And the war on youth takes two forms. There's a hard war and a soft war. The soft war is the war of endless commercialization and commodification. Kids are treated as commodities. They're told that the only thing that really matters is buying and selling. They're bombarded every day by an ideology in multiple forms, on multiple platforms, that tell them that self-interest is the ultimate interest, and that what really matters is buying and disposing goods, and advertising goods, and branding themselves. The hard war is a war in which increasingly what we find are kids being punished in ways unlike we've ever seen before. We have the school-to-prison pipeline where you've got endless numbers. And when I say kids, young people, I'm talking about low-income, poor minority students. These students have become disposable. And as a disposable population, there's almost no investment in them except basically to get them out of the way, put them in schools that basically contain them. And once they get out of those schools, then they find themselves basically in what we might call the mass incarceration state. I mean, we live in a country in which more people are in prison than any other country in the world. And not only that, we live in a country in which there are more people in prison at this time, 70% of which are people of color, than there were in Stalin's gulags at its height. So I think that what you see here is, as the social state is diminished, as the welfare state and all of the funding that goes into it for not just social provisions like Medicare, but also schools and so forth and so on, you see taking place the rise of the punishing state. The punishing state compensates for all these gaps. Because think about this: all of a sudden you have kids who are unemployed. You have what we call a zero. This is the zero generation. Zero hope, zero employment, zero futures. And it seems to me that these kids, there's no spaces for them. And the only spaces that we find for them, the default space, has now basically become the prison. So you have something called punishment creep, where the model of the prison now begins to seep into other institutions. And you see it particularly in schools around zero tolerance policies, where kids are being, there are more policemen in schools than there are teachers. And what you see kids being handcuffed, put in the back of police cars for violating dress codes or for doodling on their on their desk. We're not talking about 17-year-olds. We're talking about 10-year-olds. What kind of language nourishes the notion of civic life? What kind of formative culture has to be in place? What kind of public spheres have to be available? What kind of institutions have to provide support for people to be critical, to engage in dialogue, to participate and believe that what really matters is not only a sense of self, but a sense of social responsibility? And increasingly what we've seen for the last 35 years is an ideology that has basically completely undermined that sense of social responsibility. Think about it. We have right-wing Republicans in the United States Congress and in the Senate saying things like, kids who get free lunches in schools should be forced to work. We have people saying that, grasping onto this logic of rabid individualism and individual responsibility and this absolutely eviscerated notion of freedom, right? It's freedom from, not freedom to, right? Freedom is a negative force, right? That people are ultimately responsible for their own fate. As if larger structural forces don't exist. As if the problems that people face, for instance, massive pollution, is caused by me, and not by the major corporations. And so there's what we've seen disappear in this discourse, which is to me the essence of the problem, is an inability to translate private troubles into larger structural public considerations. We have no way of understanding that link anymore, because what we've done is we've defined freedom in a way that suggests it's the freedom to do anything you want and screw everybody else. We've defined self-interest as the ultimate measure of what it means to take responsibility for yourself. We've made the claim that social responsibility is a pathology. But what you really need is, you need a new birth, right? We need somebody else. We need a party that really says, hey, look, we don't believe society should be defined by corporations. We don't believe in this massive inequality in wealth and income. We believe in justice. Justice is something that shouldn't be bought. Everybody should have the basic social provisions that expands the possibility for their own agency. Everybody. That's a social issue. That's not just an issue of individual responsibility. So I think we have to draw a new map. We have to in some way embrace a new set of policies. We saw hints of that with the Occupy movement. We saw hints of it with the Quebec student movement, this year. We see hints of it in the No Idle movement among indigenous populations in Canada. And I think that, that's a long march to the revolution, to the institutions. It takes time. education is at the center of politics. It's at the center. It's not just something that happens in schools. It happens all over the place. It happens in the cultural apparatuses. It happens here in terms of this interview. It happens in terms of how corporations try to define what counts and what doesn't. And education has to be reclaimed. It has to have a very different mission and a very different purpose and a very different set of practices. It's not about methods. It's basically about educating people in ways to enhance their sense of critique, to expand the critical imagination, to lead them to believe that they can think. In order to think otherwise, in order to act otherwise, they have to think otherwise. And it also suggests that they have to do it collectively, that they can't do it individually. So you need a formative culture at work that once again reclaims all those things that matter in a civic culture: compassion, justice, equality, the ability to relate to others in a way that expands and deepens the very process of democracy itself. And secondly, you need social movements that are broad-based. We can't, identity politics is fine, and it addresses specific issues, but we need broad-based social movements that address the totality of society. I think you gotta live standing up rather than on your knees, I think you have to believe in something other than yourself. I think that you have to believe that the world can be a better place, and you need to fight for it. I think you have to believe that you can't do it alone. You have to do it collectively. And I think you have to believe that justice is going dead in us all the time, and we have to find ways to revive that. And we have to do it in ways that's compassionate, engages the notion of social responsibility, takes seriously what it means to be intellectually alive, and always to spark the imagination and to always take risks.
Okay, so yeah, some really good points there, and Giroux paints a really stark picture of how the world has been consistently turning for the last 30 years, really, and it's this convergence of that sort of the dominant sort of neoliberal agenda, combined with this sort of upshoot in different new technologies and different forms of engagement that make it, there's a real sort of phenomenon aspect on top of it. Again, something we would have discussed elsewhere, just in terms of like the emergence of games in particular, But what I just wanted to kind of describe here now is just this other element of it, or like a different definition of globalization, including these sort of cultures and different types of behaviors. I'll just read through this long quote and then comment on it after. Rapid increases in the number of forcibly dispossessed persons, often casualties of ethnic and nationalist conflicts to which we have referred, have created millions of individuals without a firm sense of place or home. At the same time as the potential for international mobility has become easier, there are those at the other end of the transnational spectrum who move in and out of, and back and forth from various nation states according to convenience. The hybridity inherent in the concept of transnationalism and the understanding that one need not assert unitary allegiance to country, language, culture, or ethnicity in affirming one's identity, or indeed the possibility that one can negotiate multiple identities within these spheres, are characteristics suggestive of a larger meaning of globalization. So, there's a lot going on there, and there's just one of the key points I wanted to pull out was this sort of, this flux going on, and there's a few versions of it where, you have people who are kind of forced to flee, from from their homelands, and that being like, not having that sense of place or home in the physical sense of it. And then there's, others who have the luxury of doing that with the, who are able to kind of move across borders easier than they've ever been able to before. This combined with, the new technologies, not really concern us too much with having to, when it comes to our identity or what we represent ourselves opposite, and that becoming a bit more nebulous or a bit vague with all this sort of transitions going on, and that's kind of that sort of a switch in what we actually relate to, or where our allegiance is in relation to a country, language, culture, or ethnicity, affirming an identity, and for that to kind of have given way along with everything else is a pretty, seismic shift in who we are and what we relate to. So if we take all that and combine it with, you know, this other concept which Giroux spoke of there of identity politics, and like that essentially being a bubble that you're in terms of identity politics, and just, you know, how you would narrow your identity and what you would relate to, and looking at it in a narrower form rather than the broad base, as he suggested, all combined to something much more cloistered and closed off and really sort of peculiar in terms of just leading to something more insular and introspective, you know. So what I want, you know, what I really want to get at then is just to talk about those elements of the bubble and how we can kind of utilize these technologies, or what is new within, say, youth movements in particular, that can kind of who for whom this is all sort of firsthand, you know, like it's second nature to that. They've just been born into this sort of phenomena of like all these things kind of changing, and what's kind of going to give in relation to that. So I just want to push it out once more. First off, to just include all that and just get a real sense of this bubble that's going up and what's actually happening with protest movements, and you know, what we identify with and how we're representing this stuff. And there's one argument from Adam Curtis here, which will, you know, it's his sort of essay form of making films, but there's some really relevant points in it. So we'll just run this and then come back and comment on a few of these other points that come up in it.
People in Britain and America now began to turn away from politics. The effects of the Iraq War had been very powerful. Not only did millions of people feel that they had been lied to over the weapons of mass destruction, but there was a deeper feeling that whatever they did or said had no effect, that despite the mass protests and the fears and the warnings, the war had happened anyway. Liberals, radicals, and a whole new generation of young people retreated. They turned instead to another world that was free of this hypocrisy and the corruption of politics. They went into cyberspace.
Once upon a time it was you and I.
By now, cyberspace had become even more sophisticated and responsive to human interaction. The online world was full of algorithms that could analyse and predict human behaviour. The man behind much of this was a scientist called Judea Pearl. He was the godfather of modern artificial intelligence. Pearl's breakthrough had been to use what were called Bayesian belief networks. They were systems that could predict behaviour even when the information was incomplete. But to make the system work, Pearl and others had imported a model of human beings drawn from economics. They created what were called rational agents, software that mimicked human beings, but in a very simplified form. The model assumed that the agent would always act rationally in order to get what it wanted, nothing more. One of the early utopians of cyberspace, Jaron Lanier, warned of the implications of this. The agent's model of what you are interested in will always be a cartoon, and in return, you will see a cartoon version of the world through the agent's eyes. And, he added, it will never be clear who they are working for, you or someone else. New technology began to allow people to upload millions of images and videos into cyberspace. And the web, which up to that point had seemed like an abstract other world,
began to look and feel like the real world.
No, not that.
From videos of animals, personal moments of experience, extraordinary events, to horrific terror videos, more and more was uploaded. And in a strange, sad twist, the first terrorist beheading video that was posted online was that of Judea Pearl's own son, Daniel Pearl. He was a journalist for the Wall Street Journal and had been kidnapped by radical Islamists in Pakistan. They recorded what they said was his confession, and then his killing.
My name is Daniel Pearl. I'm a Jewish American. I come from, on my father's side, a family of Zionists. My father's Jewish. My mother's Jewish. I'm Jewish. Only now do I think about that some of the people in Guantanamo Bay must be in a similar situation.
This was a new world that the old systems of power found it very difficult to deal with. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the security agencies secretly collected data from millions of people online. One program was called Optic Nerve. It took stills from the webcam conversations of millions of people across the world, trying to spot terrorists planning another attack. The program did not discover a single terrorist, but it did discover something else. A top-secret assessment said, "Unfortunately, there are issues with undesirable images within the data. It would appear that a surprising number of people are using webcam conversations to show intimate parts of their body to the other person. Also, the fact that the software allows more than one person to view a webcam stream means that it appears to be being used to broadcast pornography." But increasingly, people were using the internet in other ways, to present themselves as they wanted to be seen.
I guess a video blog is about me. I don't really want to tell you where I live because you could stalk me.
The web drew people in because it was mesmerizing. It was somewhere that you could explore and get lost in any way you wanted. But behind the screen, like in a two-way mirror, the simplified agents were watching and predicting and guiding your hand on the mouse.
Stop! I nearly threw my phone away. Stop. Stop. Pose.
Snap a selfie. There you go.
There you go.
My name is Sweetie. The men asked me to take off my clothes. They undress. They play with themselves. But what they don't know, I'm not real. I'm a computer model, made piece by piece to track down these men who do this.
As the intelligence systems online gathered ever more data, new forms of guidance began to emerge. Social media created filters, complex algorithms that looked at what individuals liked and then fed more of the same back to them. In the process, individuals began to move, without noticing, into bubbles that isolated them from enormous amounts of other information. They only heard and saw what they liked. And the news feeds increasingly excluded anything that might challenge people's pre-existing beliefs.
It's alright, I know my own life is coming. I see you will go. You are so
version of cyberspace that was rising up seemed to be very much like William Gibson's original vision. That behind the superficial freedoms of the web were a few giant corporations with opaque systems that controlled what people saw and shaped what they thought. And what was even more mysterious was how they made their decisions about what you should like and what should be hidden from you. But then, the other utopian vision of cyberspace re-emerged.
Taking over the roadway. Take it!
After the financial crash of 2008, the politicians saved the banks. But they did practically nothing about the massive corruption that was revealed in its wake. And the reason they gave was that it might destabilise the system. Public anger burst out. The Occupy movement took over Wall Street, and then the Senate in Washington.
The issue is that certain individuals that are very wealthy have pretty much corrupted our political system, and this is like the heart of it. I mean, this is a Senate building. These people have been voted off, and they basically corrupted our democracy, and it's literally killing people. I'm an Iraqi war vet, went to Iraq in 2009, to see what happens firsthand when we let corruption rule our government and our democracy, and we're coming here today basically just to raise awareness.
What drove the Occupy movement was the original dream of the internet that people like John Perry Barlow had outlined in the early 1990s. In his declaration of the independence of cyberspace, Barlow had described a new world, free of politics and the old hierarchies of power. A space where people connected together as equals in a network, and built a new society without leaders. Now, the Occupy movement set out to build that kind of society in the real world. The camps were to be the models. All the meetings used the idea of the human microphone. People throughout the crowd repeated a speaker's words so everyone could hear them.
We are now going to vote on whether to stay here for the next 2 hours or leave now.
But if someone wanted to challenge the speaker, the human amplifiers also had to repeat their words. So their voice had equal power.
What she said, what she said, what's that, the proposal.
Each person was an autonomous individual who expressed what they believed. But together they became components in a network that organised itself through the feedback of information around the system. You could organise people without the exercise of power.
Okay, so just cut it off there, but yeah, it's some interesting points in there, you know. Mostly this sort of the kind of realignment of the original internet or vision for it back onto, you know, this self-organizing system of people in public places as the Occupy movement would have demonstrated there, and how it is illustrated in Adam Curtis's film there. And, you know, just that sort of the peculiarity kind of manifesting a little bit and settling in, and then just becoming like a new norm or something, and the new set of constraints to work within, I suppose. So all it really points to is there's just this constant struggle over to and froing between, you know, the good and true and noble reasons why, you know, this technology would have been invented. If we had Berners-Lee talk about it in the previous lecture, and then this sort of pull of where this can be monetized or how it can be used for social control, and all those sort of elements where there's just a certain sort of a drag in different directions. But it is interesting when we see where we get to like points of, say, a critical mass within it. And how many things kind of have to realign opposite that, really, once we have this sort of once there's a movement of people really with that. So if we kind of pull it back into frame with, say, well, with younger people, but in general with critical thinking, or, you know, I'm going to use critical thinking as a model opposite just mindless consumerism, really. And we just have to kind of ask ourselves, well, what is it that, like, you know, is obstructing people from really seeing, if they have all the information in front of them or at the tip of their fingertips, why they don't and won't or can't access that information. So again, this is just a snapshot, and it's really just to raise the sort of discussion and, you know, raise the issues rather than being anyway sort of, you know, comprehensive. But there's just a few points of what might be the obstacles to that, like unmet survival needs, prejudice, bias and oppression, unreflective acceptance of societal or cultural attitudes and beliefs, stereotypes, blind obedience and deference to authority, loaded language of it, limited access to information around this, whatever that issue might be, or whatever, you know, whatever understanding might be missing with that, one-sided thinking, or psychological blocks such as anxiety, depression, trauma, consumerism, arrogance, whatever, you know, just different sort of personalized, internalized things. And it seems that the sort of what needs to be arrived at before people kind of, the emergent principle almost of it, where people kind of, you know, see it for what it is, and just the injustice or the outrage of it demands using these technologies to find a new way of gathering or moving or organizing. That's kind of, you know, the constant sort of shift with it. And it seems that the business side, marketing and consumerism, is on the opposite side, trying to kind of manage all of this back into a certain sort of a shape. I'm going to show another video, which is to speak of the this sort of consumerism gone mad, I suppose, where we see like how sort of irrational it can be at a certain level.
If the classical ideology functioned in the way designated by Marx in his nice formula from Capital Volume 1, Sie wissen das nicht, aber sie tun es. They don't know what they are doing, but they are nonetheless doing it. Cynical ideology functions in the mode of, I know very well what I'm doing, but I'm still nonetheless doing it. This paradoxical constellation is staged in a beautiful way in the famous song Officer Krapke in Bernstein's and Sondheim's West Side Story.
Hey, you!
Who, me, Officer Krapke?
Yeah, you! Give me one good reason for not dragging you down to the station house, you punk!
Dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you gotta understand, it's just our bringing up that gets us out of hand. Our mothers all are junkies, our fathers all are drunks. Golly Moses, naturally we're punks. Gee, Officer Krupke, we're very upset. We never had
the delinquent gang enacts a whole explanation, as a musical number, of course, of why they are delinquent.
There is good, there is good, there is untapped good, like inside the West of us is good.
Addressing the police officer Krapke, who is not there, but all is addressed to the police officer.
That's a good story! Let me tell it to the world! Just tell it to the judge!
So one of them adopts the position of a judge.
Dear kindly judge, your honor, my parents treat me rough. With all the marijuana, they won't give me a puff.
Then the psychological explanation.
He shouldn't be here. This boy don't need a couch, he needs a useful career. Society's played him a terrible trick. Unsociologically, he's sick.
I am sick. We are sick. We are sick.
The paradox here is, how can you know all this and still do it? This is the cynical functioning of ideology. They are never what they appear to be. Cynical, brutal delinquents. They always have a tiny private dream. This dream can be many things. It can even be something quite ordinary. Let's take the English riots of August 2011. The standard liberal explanation really sounds like a repetition of Officer Krapke's song. we cannot just condemn these riots as delinquent vandalism. You have to see how these people live in practically ghettos, isolated communities, no proper family life, no proper education. They don't even have a prospect of a regular employment. But this is not enough, because man is not simply a product of objective circumstances. We all have this margin of freedom in deciding how we subjectivize these objective circumstances, which of course determine us. How we react to them by constructing our own universe. The conservative solution is we need more police, we need courts which pass severe judgments. I think this solution is too simple. If one listened closely to some of David Cameron's statements, it looked as if, okay, they are beating people, burning houses, but the truly horrible thing is that they were taking objects without paying for them. No, that's the ultimate sin that we can imagine, in a very limited way. Cameron was right. There was no ideological justification. It is the reaction of people who are totally caught into the predominant ideology, but have no ways to realize what this ideology demands of them. So it's a kind of a wild acting out within this ideological space of consumerism. Even if we are dealing with a apparently totally non-ideological brutality, I just want to burn houses to get objects, it is the result of a very specific social and ideological constellation, where big ideology, striving for justice, equality, etc., disintegrates. The only functioning ideology is pure consumerism, and then no wonder what you get as a form of protest. Every violent acting out is a sign that there is something you are not able to put into words. Even the most brutal violence is the enacting of a certain symbolic deadlock.
Okay, so, kind of, it's a little bit abstract there, I suppose, but valid all the same, or I'd hope it is. Sorry, I'm just looking for an image. So what we see there is that sort of, a pure form of protest through the consumerism, which is an interesting sort of angle to look at that from, or a different frame to look at it through, where you have this sort of an acting out as a result of just massive void of a disconnect between having any sort of a say in a representative government, or in any sort of, any level of having a voice being heard, or being fully alienated from it. And the only connection and link is towards a consumerist model. So naturally that's the one that's going to fall when there's any sort of a reaction to it, which, has to come out in a somewhat irrational way. That's just one element of what can happen when it comes to this level of disempowerment. And we just want to kind of, I just want to bring it on from there, really, to just see, because it's almost like a form of game, really. And we're just going to see some sort of behavior change in relation to, young people in particular, and how they really relate to this sort of disconnect or this drop off with it, really. Just a few images what I had from Adbusters, but the gist of it being that, you get online, there's any sort of any number of memes or different sort of opinions or notices good that just instantly channel through news feeds or Twitter or Facebook posts, and these represent almost a form of an endorsement or a rejection, each one of these. So I just wanted to kind of point in that direction, maybe that's somewhere where the protest has been reduced to that level almost for some people, where it looks like that just associating or identifying next to a meme that appears in your feed is the power of your individual voice, that you've been that sort of removed and made into a functioning part of or just a simple consumer of all these, a disempowered consumer of all these processes and different products that come with it, really. And that's just something that I wanted to point out. But on the other side now, there's there is a more coherent youth version of it, and it's just it is the game changer in terms of whatever political shift is next going to happen in a democratic sense, where it'll be the youth vote. And this is kind of well known that the youth vote is the one that kind of changes a lot of these issues in Western democracies in particular. But I just want to show a TED talk to that end, just to kind of give us an idea of what the differences are, where this disconnect might be coming from.
Well, there's been a lot of noise recently about falling voting rates among youth. Some, usually us young people, we like to claim that politicians and political parties don't advocate messages or agendas that really appeal to us. Others, often our parents and our parents' generation, claim that schools aren't teaching enough civics and that our society doesn't create political behavior in young people. And still others, often our grandparents' generation, like to claim that youth are just self-centered and lazy and likely undeserving of the right to vote anyway. It is these substantial differences that are leading to a miscommunication between youth and their engagement in politics. A few weeks ago, I heard a politician speak to a group of young people, and one of the things he said really stuck out to me. He said, "Young people are not voting and not getting interested in politics. It is those that do that will actually make the difference." Although I strongly disagree with this statement, from a narrow point of view, he is correct. Youth have the lowest voter turnout at about 37% for those under the age of 25. By this measure, we youth really don't participate or engage in politics. And we've all heard the insults against youth in politics, that youth are dropping out of politics, that we're eroding political behavior. I've even heard some go as far as to claim that this generation will bring the destruction of democracy. These charges are often harshly stated. And after hearing these criticisms, I did what any self-respecting, rebellious young person would do. I set out to prove them wrong. One of my first realizations was that voting isn't a particularly engaging form of participation. I mean, how exciting is it really to check off a ballot, fold it up, and put it in a box? Personally, I can think of a few things that I would rather be doing, and, dare I say, would probably have more impact. But don't get me wrong, voting is a vital part of our society, and we really should all vote. But it is important to acknowledge that there are other, more engaging forms of participation. And it is this generation of connectedness, of ideas, of innovation, some of which we heard of today, that is leading this reinvention of politics. So, youth. almost 60% of us engage in some form of non-voting political behavior. Compare that, though, to 38%, less than 38% of those under the age of 50. Yet if we look at voting turnout, the stats are completely opposite. So what is it that we include in this non-voting political behavior? Things like political demonstrations, volunteering, social and internet media, or even using the marketplace as a form of political expression through boycotts or boycotts. The Occupy protests taking place in New York and around the world are a prime example of youth getting engaged. And in the last Canadian election, the federal election, not the one that took place yesterday, was characterized by flash mob videos with students across the country coming together to try and motivate youth participation in the election. But what really made this idea hit home for me was right here in BC during the petition to bring the HST to a referendum. A boy no older than 14 came to my door asking for signatures on the petition. He wasn't even tall enough for me to see through the door's window, nor would he have even been able to vote in the referendum. Outside of voting, our age group shows levels of participation greater than any other age category. These charges of political apathy among youth are using a very narrow definition of politics. This generation, my generation, our generation is not dropping out of politics, but shifting to new and different forms of participation. So why are we seeing participation change? Why are we seeing engagement change forms? Well, I mentioned one reason, that traditional measures of politics aren't particularly engaging, like voting. But more importantly, youth and politics are constantly misinterpreting each other. It seems that for youth, politics has become synonymous with self-serving, narrow, partisan political behavior, and therefore of little interest to us. And there's also a failure in interpreting youth's activism and engagement back into traditional politics. When asked his opinion of the student flash mob videos made in the last Canadian election, Cabinet Minister John Baird said, "I'm not sure what a flash mob is, but it sounds a bit disconcerting. I don't know about flash or mobs, but I don't like the context of either word." For you and some university students and community organizers, Baird's comments made them chuckle. But it really underscored a wider problem in the last, and frankly, in all Canadian elections, this disconnect between politicians and the younger electorate. Dozens of projects have been implemented over the last 20 years to try and motivate youth to vote, but none have been successful. It was predicted that the last federal election, the one characterized by these flash mob videos, would finally reverse declining youth turnout. But it never happened, and the numbers were as low as ever. It is this lack of mutual understanding that plagues these attempts. If government were to broaden its definition of political involvement, we may see more youth engage in traditional measures of politics. For example, polling stations are in churches, community centers, and elementary school gyms. By a quick show of hands, how many have been in one of those in the last week? Okay. Not including voting yesterday, how many have been in one of those in the last week? A few. Now, imagine if they were on university campuses, in shopping malls, or even the local Starbucks. How many have been in one of those in the last week? A significantly higher number, as I suspected. Now, I'm not saying that we need to lease out every single coffee shop for the next Canadian election. But what I am trying to say is we need to re-examine how youth and politics understand each other. Feeling misunderstood or not catered to is no excuse not to make your voice heard. Things like the HST petition, the flash mob videos, and the Occupy protests are examples of youth using their engagement to try and make their voice heard. And the good news is that those who engage in some form of alternative political behavior tend to vote more often. So I implore you to get out there and boycott, protest, and volunteer. The important thing is making your voice heard. Because rather than being indifferent, youth engagement is merely different. Thank you.
Okay, so a number of really interesting points from Jacob Helliwell there. Mostly, I just want to flag a couple of things where, you know, it's only when you hear it that it just paints a picture of, it might appear the, you know, traditional location of polling stations appears like some form of indoctrination to an old, outmoded sort of system of like these sort of buildings and infrastructure that don't really identify or relate to young people whatsoever. And that kind of could answer a few things where if your initial involvement or experience is to be brought to a church to cast your vote, like how unusual and alien that could appear. And rightly so. But overall, in a wider sort of note, it really, you know, most of the points that he makes there do speak to this gross disconnect between generations and understanding different sort of phenomena around technologies or the interplay with technology with a younger generation, and how subtle and sophisticated that younger generation actually is with using those tools. And, you know, again, that can kind of point to this sort of knee-jerk sort of overreaction of social control again when it comes to any sort of a movement flaring up, or, you know, a popular movement flaring up and becoming a mass-mediated event overnight can look much more drastic than it previously might have. I'm reminded of like the Hong Kong protests, the umbrella protest movement of a few years ago, like a peaceful protest movement in the first instance, using this sort of very interesting visual side of it and a lot of sort of almost flash mob coordinated actions and behaviors across people, almost like a living meme to communicate a point. And it was a really effective way of, you know, organizing and protesting, and one that kind of caught the authorities well off guard, really, and continues to do so. So, you know, there's an enormous amount of sort of sophistication going on there as well, which is, you know, I had to kind of include within this just to kind of show how layered and multiple and rich and diverse it actually is when it comes to youth movement, youth protest, and youth perception of all these sorts of issues, which sadly concern them mostly in terms of depleting resources, whatever sort of environmental disasters we're heading towards, in, you know, a country, a globe with, you know, massive sort of debt and all those other things. So, you know, any way that young people feel protest needs to happen is possibly valid by now. I want to talk about just in terms of games. I know we'd spoken of it previously, but I just want to kind of nod towards games before I finish off here. And, you know, just kind of referring back to previous points about technologies. It was one of the lectures we had a while ago. Technologies not necessarily fulfilling the purpose for which they were made. And if we look at like Twitch and Discord, there could be an element of that there, where you have these like social media platforms for like game streaming or games forums, and, you know, there's other elements attaching to that, where it's becoming platforms for expression, or, you know, for just live feeds of campaigns and protest movements and stuff like this as well, and a whole sort of fracture. So if we take Discord, for example, a real sort of you know, battlefield between, you know, extreme left and right wing views happening there in this sort of games forum, which is kind of interesting, you know. And all I really wanted to flag there was that it just, things can kind of come out of the most perceptibly innocuous sort of places, really. On the right, we just have a couple of games that I wanted to kind of look at. I put Grand Theft Auto in here just because I wanted to speak to that Zizek video about the, you know, the acting out against pure consumerism and this sort of powerlessness that comes with it, and you know the vandalism and the destruction being the only form of expression. And I just wanted to flag that perhaps in the absence of serious games or political games or social activist gaming culture, that has replaced that sort of same sentiment. And I just wanted to kind of leave a note to that. But at the bottom here we have Paintball Hero, which is a game created by a 17-year-old game developer, Skylar Thomas, about animal liberation. And this is like an animal rights activist since early childhood and teamed up with PETA to make this game. So, you know, we're still at a very early inception of what we consider serious games and what can kind of come with that. One last video I just want to show about one game which is quite interesting to me, and you know, though it had been planned to be released in 2015, only was released at the end of last year, and this is Riot Civil Unrest. So I'll just show this video. This is just kind of an introduction to the game, and come back to close off with a few comments then.
Hello there guys, welcome back to Super Happy and Gaming News. My name is Jack and we've got another interview from EGX for you now. It was our interview with the guys behind Riot Civil Unrest. Interesting game where you play as both the mob and the police trying to control the situation, based on real life events such as the risings in Egypt, Italy riots as well. But don't take my word for anything that goes on. Please listen to the interview. Let us know what you think in the comments down below. So welcome back to Super Happy and Gaming here at EGX. I'm here with Nick from Merge Games and we're talking about Civil Unrest.
Yeah, Riot Civil Unrest.
And just tell me about the game itself. And so the name kind of gives away what's happening in it, but give us a little description of what happens.
Yeah, it kind of does. I'll give you a bit of a background as well. So the game's creator, Leonard, was actually involved in some riots in northern Italy. Right. They called the no-tab riots. The tab was their high-speed rail link that the Italians were going to put in. And he went down there to protest, got talking to the protesters, shall we call them rioters, and sort of got their point of view. And then actually during the conflicts and skirmishes, he got talking to some of the riot police. And he actually found they were on common ground because the riot police were just doing their job to try and keep the peace and stop public damage, but shared their same sort of beliefs that actually the train line going through this area was wrong. Okay. So from that, he's a filmmaker by trade, and he thought what a great medium it would be for gaming. So you can actually get in there and be in control of the riot, so to speak, and find out what it's like on behalf of both the rioters and the police, because you have to play both factions.
Yeah, I was going to say, I having a quick go myself and played as the riot police just there,
yeah.
So you can take control of either faction?
Yeah, and you're actually encouraged to do so. So as the game begins, there are 4 levels, or campaigns, shall we say. Northern Italy and the no-tab is one of them. We've got the Arab Spring in Egypt, a couple of others. As you play those and experience the game from both factions' side, you work your way through, and then you open up a number of bonus levels. So we've got other real-life riots in there, so like the Ukraine is in there, Oakland in Northern California is in there, and many others.
Okay, so it's all historical riots. It's nothing that's been made up just for the game?
No, absolutely not. What we don't want to do is come across as a bit preachy and tell you, no, this riot is because of this and because of that. There's Googles out there and you can go and find out what's behind the riots and believe which side you want to believe. Okay. But really it's just, this is how it was, this is the situation, and you take it from there. Okay.
So going back to that, so either side, so what kind of abilities, kind of weapons or side do you have at your disposal to try and win your side in that kind of unrest? Okay,
well the first thing to stress is really the best way to win is to try and be as passive as possible. Aggression causes problems further down the line for you. So the police, you can load out with either heavily armoured police, snatch squads, there's water cannon, there are tear gas guys there, and generally the police have to clear areas or hold their ground and do that. If they do it passively and hold their ground for the allotted amount of time, that's great. But sometimes when the rioters get agitated, they'll become aggressive. So the police can act sort of in kind. For their part, the rioters generally, 80% of the rioters there are really there just they want to be heard, they want to protest, they're not there to cause trouble. Yeah. You have got agitators within the crowd, and there's a hierarchy system where there'll be a leader, he will have a number of lieutenants, and you control the leader, you give the commands out, which then the 80% are very sheep-like, and they will sort of follow what the crowd do. Okay. You can charge the police, you can just go passively forward and stand in their faces. You can throw some of the street furniture, you can rip that up and throw that. There's petrol bombs in there, cherry bombs, firecrackers, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So ideally, as you play the game, it's easy to win. If you're the police and you have to drive the crowd back, it's easy to do by back charging.
Yeah.
And you'll win the level, you'll complete it, congratulations. But public opinion in the background, at the end of every level, the newspaper will come up and tell you sort of a storyline of how the riots are going. And if you're overly aggressive, public opinion and sympathy will sway to the other side.
Okay.
So ultimately, it becomes harder.
Yeah.
At subsequent levels, if you're the police and you're violent, then in the next round, the rioters are already, they're sort of G'd up and they're already agitated and angry.
Okay.
So it becomes harder again.
So you have to think. So it's very strategic when you're actually playing the level. Then you've got to think forward ahead of time. So you don't want to make it harder for yourself in the long run by hitting the wrong person at the wrong time.
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, generally they're within the crowd with the rioters. They're press teams. So you'll get caught doing stuff. So yeah, softly is the best approach. Occasionally you have to use a bit of strong arm tactics, but on the whole, take it easy.
Okay, that's very interesting the way that kind of system works, and trying to show both sides of the story and how you're trying to do it without being aggressive, which is something that if you're just looking at this game firsthand, you might think, well, you're just here to kick a few heads in. But that's, but what I've seen and what I've heard, it's nothing like that at all.
No, well, you can play it like that. I mean, there's certainly in the campaign mode, that's the way to go. Later on, when you've unlocked the levels and you're playing either a skirmish mode against the computer or a head-to-head mode, then you load up as you see fit. So if you want to go and steam in and cause trouble, if you're the rioters, load up on petrol bombs. Why not? So there is that element in there. You can have that element of fun. Going forward, as well as the game itself, we're launching a level editor with it.
Okay.
So we might create extra levels using the level editor, but it's and that'll be like free DLC. But I'm really interested to see what the community will create. So we're here at the NEC. You could do the outside of the NEC, put some street furniture down, load up your rioters and your police, and have a riot at the NEC if you so wish. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, PlayStation and Xbox all of a sudden start having a go at each other. Perhaps.
You could do that. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to include that just to kind of outline this potentially really interesting type of game that's come along there, a riot simulator, and that being like a forum and a form of discourse in itself that could happen. I'm particularly interested in a level editor or open sources and opening it out to a community to build levels of that and what that could do for advocacy or campaigning in particular. And also to jump forward 2, 3, 5 years into the future where you've got like virtual reality, augmented reality environments with this type of game, or probably this game in particular, and how kind of, pedestrian that would make something like Grand Theft Auto look that far along, or infantile, I suppose, And I just wanted to kind of flag that because it was, as I said, it only got released there just before Christmas. And it's a really interesting model for a game to build simulators like that, and it'd just be interesting how far that can actually extend into, be it protest movements, forms of discourse, or mediation, moderation, or whatever has to happen in between, really, about really kind of sore topics and hard subjects to take on for a lot of people, I'm sure. I'm going to finish up now. I'm going to do it with a Henry Giraud quote about basically pointing to knowledge being power, and critical thinking and a literate public have become dangerous to those who want to celebrate orthodoxy over dialogue, emotion over reason, and ideological certainty over thoughtfulness. So, just to kind of encapsulate a few of those sentiments he would have expressed earlier as well, and hopefully endorsed by different aspects of it, and speaking to you as a youth worker, these are things that need to be kind of instilled and imparted to young people, and kind of, invite them to those platforms if they're not already there, or surely to inform or further encourage them if they are involved in their own futures. And that's it. On that point, I'll leave it. Next lecture will be on critical analysis of digital content in youth work. Should you have any questions in between, please feel free to drop me an email and I'll get back to you about that. Okay, thanks. Bye.